Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I am the Omniviewer, and welcome to Genre Bender's Obscurities and Flawed Gems, where we look at the best stuff you've never heard of. Christian entertainment has somewhat of a bad reputation, and speaking as a Christian myself, I can't say that reputation is completely undeserved.
The most recent examples of Christian movies people have zeroed in on can easily be described as being somewhat propagandistic in nature. Christian novels can often suffer from a similar issue, not to mention sometimes having meandering plots or being tonally confused. We also all know the joke about how popular Christian music just replaces girl with God. Yet as with all things, the idea that it's all bad isn't a universal truth. The sentiment does not, for example, apply to the novels of C.S. Lewis or Frank Peretti, whose respective works are hailed as masterpieces. It also doesn't account for works by mainstream artists who incorporate their Christian faith into their work, such as Alice Cooper or Eiji Tsuburaya.
It's human nature to perseverate on the negative, but that doesn't mean the positive isn't there. I'm here to focus on the positive, and seeing as how today is the 4th of July, I figured what better opportunity is there to look at a Christian film rooted in the origins of America itself, not to mention the American tradition of superheroes. That film is Beyond the Mask, and it's much better than you might initially think.
In the year 1776, a masked vigilante has taken to the streets of colonial Philadelphia. Known only as the Highwayman, he's gaining a reputation among the colonists as a hero who opposes British tyranny and selflessly stands up for the common man. If only they knew the truth. The Highwayman is actually one William Reynolds, a mercenary formerly employed by the East India Company to carry out assassinations and raids that are strictly off the record. Reynolds had hoped to retire peacefully after his last job a year ago, but since he knows too much, he found himself the target of a hit by his former employer, Charles Kemp. Reynolds survived and has been on the run ever since, adopting various disguises and biding his time until he can get revenge on Kemp. His stint as the highwayman in the colonies is but his most recent mask. Though he is driven by revenge, he will find his priorities reevaluated, his path will cross with that of the Founding Fathers, and he just might prove crucial to saving the revolution before it's even really begun.
Admit it, you're at least somewhat intrigued by that premise. It's kind of like a mix of Zorro and the Scarlet Pimpernel set during the American War for Independence, and with John Rhys Davies as the villain. That alone might be enough to convince some of you to check out Beyond the Mask. But like I said, this is a Christian film, a subgenre with a less than stellar reputation in the secular world. So, for those of you who still need convincing, that's what this review is for.
First and foremost, the production values of this movie are quite impressive for something that's essentially an indie film.
Period costume dramas are not cheap to make, especially if you want them to look authentic. And while Beyond the Mask isn't as lavish as your average Hollywood example, it works well with what it's got.
Whether you're talking about the costumes or the special effects, you can tell that effort was put into making sure the film looked as good as possible. The result is something that, while still a small-scale project, is never an eyesore to look at. Even the few times the special effects don't quite look the best, they don't stand out as especially horrendous, probably because they're consistent with the film's overall aesthetic.
Performances are also good across the board.
You already know that John Rhys Davies is always amazing, and he doesn't disappoint here. He makes Kemp a properly menacing villain, which is essential to any good superhero story.
But let's not forget about the other actors, who may not have the same level of name recognition, but are still well suited to their roles.
Andrew Chaney is our protagonist, so the movie lives or dies on his performance, and fortunately, he's good in the role of Will Reynolds. The role requires him to play one character, assuming the identity of a whole bunch of different characters, which is not easy for even the greatest actors to do. Fortunately, he's got the chops to do it, making him just the right actor to play this character. One we ultimately want to see overcome his obstacles. More on that in a little bit. Cara Kilmer plays Charlotte Holloway, the romantic interest, which is usually a thankless role in superhero stories. Admittedly, the character of Charlotte is not an especially groundbreaking one, but she's given more to do than your average hero's girlfriend character, and once again, Cara gives a good performance all the same. Even her role of having a personal connection to the villain predates a similar twist from Spider-Man: Homecoming by almost 3 years. Meanwhile, Alan Madlane turns in a convincing performance as the ever-recognizable Ben Franklin, and given what a personality Franklin was known for having, anyone who can successfully play him deserves credit.
Part of why the actors turn in good performances has to do with the quality of the script. Though before we get into that, I must be perfectly honest with you. Plot-wise, Beyond the Mask is kinda cliché for a superhero film.
It hits all of the expected plot beats, and if not for the 18th century setting, it probably wouldn't have much to distinguish it. Think a mix of Batman Begins and Sam Raimi's Spider-Man with a hint of the Mask of Zorro, and you've got the plot described in very broad strokes. As cliché as the plot is, though, the writing of the characters and attention to historical detail are where the film shines.
That can be owed in large part to the writing staff containing members who worked on Adventures in Odyssey, another better than you might expect piece of Christian entertainment.
The fictional characters are placed into real events in a believable way, coexisting rather than intruding so as to respect the historical record. In fact, Charles Kemp's plot to stymie the revolution ties into a real, though little-known historical mystery from the period. Conversely, the historical figures fit naturally into the roles typical of superhero films. Having Ben Franklin as a sort of nicer-tempered J. Jonah Jameson works so well that I'm actually surprised it hasn't been done before.
Most importantly of all, the movie's primary focus is on telling a story and developing the characters, which is really at the heart of what makes it work.
Remember how I said the bad reputation of Christian cinema stems from a tendency to come across as propaganda? This is because the movies lean so heavily on the message that everything else becomes secondary.
To be clear, non-Christian movies can be just as guilty of this. But in a secular world, Christian movies get the lion's share of the blame. I guess, though, that's better than A Lion's Den.
Beyond the Mask, however, prioritizes being a solid movie first and foremost, thus making it a story with a message rather than a message with a story. It's similar to C.S. Lewis's Narnia books, which function as fantasy novels independently from the Christian allegories. Likewise, this movie functions as a pulpy adventure yarn independently from the message as well. Not that the message of either can be so easily ignored, but they're not forced down your throat either.
Speaking of which, what is the message in Beyond the Mask? It is a Christian movie after all, so it must have Christian values to impart.
Given the setting, you might suspect it's somehow tied to the idea of America being a Christian nation and how that should translate into modern politics. But you'd be wrong. I don't know if the filmmakers subscribe to that notion, but even if they do, the fact remains that Beyond the Mask is not a political film.
Explaining the message may require me to go into spoiler territory, but I'll do my best to avoid anything too earth-shattering in terms of plot reveals. You can jump ahead to this time to be 100% safe, but otherwise, I'm going in.
So the major theme of Will Reynolds' life is that he's constantly donning disguises for one reason or another. When we first meet him, he's a killer for hire hoping to assume the role of a foppish man about town. After surviving Kemp's assassination attempt, he disguises himself as a vicar whose own life ended while trying to save Reynolds. When he comes to the colonies, he assumes the identity of a printing apprentice at Ben Franklin's publishing house. Finally, when presented with the opportunity to bring Kemp down and redeem his own name, he dons his most literal disguise as the Highwayman. Yet at every turn, his disguises fail and he finds his situation getting worse and worse until he eventually faces execution.
When visited by another vicar in prison, Reynolds relates his various attempts at trying to redeem himself, only for the vicar to give this reply.
I'll be getting what I deserve tomorrow.
Someone else already got what you deserve.
There's your message.
Will has been attempting to redeem himself by his own means, and it never works. Any Christian will tell you that this is because redemption can only be achieved through acceptance of Jesus Christ.
The idea of turning to Christ follows Reynolds throughout the film, especially during that period where he impersonates the vicar, but he doesn't really understand it until he is at his most desperate, which is often the case for a lot of people.
The salvation of Will Reynolds cannot be found through the masks he hides behind. Rather, his salvation lies beyond the mask. Now you know where the title comes from.
That's Beyond the Mask for you. It's not a groundbreaking film, but even at its worst, it still gets the job done. Maybe you'll find it an interesting diversion, maybe it'll start you on a journey of discovering your own faith, or maybe you'll just be relieved to finally have a Christian superhero who isn't Bible Man. But either way, I recommend giving it a look. And the only thing left to say after that is Happy 4th of July. Until such time as we meet again, this is the Omniviewer signing off. Are we done yet? My arm's getting tired.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it as well as subscribe to the channel for more content of a similar nature. Also, check the description for links to our Twitter, DeviantArt, and Patreon pages, as well as the Amazon link for the novel Operation Red Dragon: The Daikaiju Wars Part 1, penned by yours truly. Thank you all, and we appreciate your support.